I'm Mike Hoeflich. I teach at the University of Kansas School of Law. I've been writing about legal history since my first article was published in 1975, which makes me an old guy.
My name is Ross Davies. I teach at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And in my spare time, I edit a law journal called The Green Bag, an entertaining journal of law, in which Professor Hoeflich has appeared many times.
Well, the Black Book is in some ways a commonplace book, which was a typical tool that lawyers and scholars used in the 19th centuries, and that where they would basically take notes about books they had read, in large part because books were very expensive, and most people, even fairly well-off people, couldn't afford to have a large library. And so they would go to a library at a university, or if it was a lawyer, at a bar association, and they would read the books there, and then they would take notes on them, and then they would have those notes to use afterwards. So in one sense, it's a commonplace book. In another sense, it is a diary, because Justice Holmes basically kept that book with him for 50 years. And he took, he put all sorts of, the things that I liked, he put all sorts of things. The things that I liked best were actually, he would walk along the Georgetown Canal and he would comment on the flowers that were coming up at any period of time. He did that about the White House too. And then he also kept in the book a list of every single book he had read for 50 years. Now, we know that he didn't always put the title of the book into the Black Book directly. He kept scraps and he would transfer them. And he did that with some of the notes. So it's a compilation also of one of the greatest jurists and Americans reading for 50 years. And then he's got other things, lists of his what he called secretaries, we now call law clerks. He's got lists of social appointments. It's just a remark. I mean, he even kept addresses of people he knew. It was an address book too. It is probably, if not unique, an enormously unusual insight into the life and thinking and reading of one of the greatest minds the United States ever produced. And as such, people say, well, what does it matter that Justice Holmes kept track of the flowers along the Georgetown Canal? And it matters a lot, because it shows a human side to somebody behind the black robe that you don't see in his writings.
My feeling about the book overall is very much like Mike's, that this is a Black book in the traditional commonplace sense, but it is also a look into the mind and spirit of this great legal thinker and great figure of public service and scholarship in American history. And it's filled with useful data for making more sense and getting a deeper understanding of his works, large and small. I'll give you one example, just for starters. In his famous dissent in Lochner versus New York, Holmes refers to Spencer's social statics. And some critics of that dissent have characterized that citation or reference to one of Spencer's books as a rhetorical flourish. That Holmes probably wasn't a real student of Spencer, didn't really know what he was talking about. He just knew that Spencer had this famous book about social statics. Well, if you spend a little time with his Black Book, what you learn is that Holmes had been reading Spencer's works for decades. And it's one thing for a judge or another writer or another decision maker to throw off a reference to a famous person. It's another thing to know that this is not a tossed off reference. This is the product of years of study. And with Holmes, as Mike says, we have decades of evidence of those years of study, ranging from the Greek classics to detective fiction. For example, Holmes never cited Dashiell Hammett and the Continental Op in any of his opinions, but he did read those stories.
Madness, a lapse of judgment, temporary insanity. No, the truth of the matter is that I was at the Harvard Law Library looking at some other things in the treasure room one day, and the then curator of rare books, a brilliant librarian and scholar, David Warrington, said, "You want to see Holmes's Black Book?" And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Sure." And I said, "Yeah." And so he brought it out and he opened it up and I looked at it and I went, "Okay, I've seen it." And he said, "You want to read it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, "Then you're going to have to transcribe it," because it is just such, I mean, Justice Holmes, I think, was a good, frugal New Englander. And so he wrote on every line, sometimes 3 times in the same line. Then he wrote in between lines. Then he wrote in the margins. And then he wrote in the margins of the margins. And, like all of us, his handwriting changed over the years. And he wrote with a steel pen. I learned that from a great scholar, Herbert Johnson, who told me that. And steel pens are not like ballpoints. You dip them in ink and you get blots, you get this, you get that. And I mean, it's just 50 years of life crammed into, this book. And I really just thought that if we've got something like that, Harvard's been terrific. They put it, they put it online in the digital format. But again, trying to read that in digital format's not easy. And so basically, I was getting to the point where I thought this would be a good retirement project, though, of course, I never ended up retiring. And I just thought, well, what better thing could I do than 6 days a week, spend an hour and a half when I wake up, blinding myself trying to transcribe this. And then I recruited colleagues and I recruited students and everybody in sight. And it took us 7 years. And it's far from perfect, as I say in my little introductory essay. But I think there's enough there that people can use it and with a magnifying glass and some effort, make most of what's in there coherent. So I consider it to be a guide to the original manuscript. It's not an edition. There are errors. We hope people will find them and send them to us. So in future editions, we can correct those. But, wouldn't it be wonderful to have, Henry VIII's personal diary he kept for 50 years? Wouldn't it be great to have Jane Addams's diary she kept for 50 years? I mean, you think about how many times do we get this kind of a document that gives the kind of insight into somebody's mind that this does. As Ross was saying, just knowing things. I mean, one of the things that I really got excited about when I started getting towards parts of the transcript with the reading list is to discover that Justice Holmes at night, mostly in the summer when he was at Beverly Farms, would read children's books. And again, I've reached an age where I'm starting to read children's books. I mean, but it's just wonderful to think about this unbelievably important figure in American history, reading the children's books from his childhood 80 years before. It shows, again, his humanity shines through in so many ways. And I just thought it was worth the time and the effort and the arguments with various people and the criticisms. But as imperfect as it is, I think if people can read the book and see Justice Holmes, the human being, the one who sat at night and read books to his wife, Fanny, the one who read mystery stories, the one who reread his childhood, books of adventure, 2 hours after reading really, really complex books on German jurisprudence in German. I mean, how many human beings can do that? I mean, it just to me, the only thing that, if I had my wish, the only thing I'd rather have was Abraham Lincoln's Commonplace book. So if anybody hears this and knows where that is, please contact me.
Mike has done, I think, all of us and the legal profession a great service by taking this on. And I think it really boils down to two things. One, Mike's own range, his own intellectual range, his ability to look at this book and to figure out what it all means and to process the range of scholarship, the languages used, the long span of the publishing history of the books that appear in it and on, about which Holmes took notes in it. That combined with, and I say this with the greatest respect, the snake charmer's ability to inspire people to join in his enterprises shows up in this book. Yes, the book is imperfect. It is not a perfect transcription, certainly, but it is also a transcription of a handwritten book written by a guy with terrible handwriting to begin with, and it only got worse over time. And bear in mind, while Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote nearly illegibly to his friends, he was at least trying to communicate with another mind when he did that. When he was writing this diary, he was writing it for an audience of one. And that one was himself. And so this handwriting did not even have the discipline to it that would come from trying to reach someone else. And so in a sense, what Mike has done in achieving this transcription is he has, perhaps more than any legal scholar ever, become one with the mind of Oliver Wendell Holmes, because he's been reading the book that Holmes meant for himself. And so this is a truly extraordinary and extraordinarily ambitious project. And it is remarkably complete. And I would suggest that the way to read it is, if I may, and I know this is a tiny bit clumsy, but if you open this book to a page, right, you have on one side the transcription, right, and on the facsimile, and on the other side you have the transcription. And what you should do is read a bit of the transcription and then test yourself. How good was Hoeflich and his pals, right? Can I incrementally improve the transcription myself just a little bit? That is what this book is for. This book is for scholars and curious readers who want to get most of it here and then employ their own intellect, their own eyes, sharper eyes. Note that both Mike and I are wearing rather strong prescription spectacles, right? To take this even a little bit further. This is turned out to be the project of I would suggest more of a middle age Mike than of retirement. And that he and I are both looking forward to seeing it taken even further. I was brought into this, I think, fairly early on as one of the people who Mike was hoping could help him with the transcription. Turns out I was quite bad at the transcription. And Mike, with tactfully but directly, let me know that he wouldn't be asking me to do any more transcription. I did end up kibitzing a little bit over time, right? When I would occasionally catch a legal term that, a classicist properly transcribed, but didn't know the legal term or what have you. But for the most part, I was on the admiring sidelines for the transcription, just only occasionally chiming in with a word. And then was brought back in later on although with plenty of fair warning, to write a chapter focusing on Holmes's relationship to the common law in his work as a judge. And that chapter is an example. And I've in preparation for this conversation, I was trying to think of an analogy here. And one that might work a little bit for at least some of the people viewing this video is that what Mike has done is he has led the creation of a gigantic bucket of legal, intellectual, cultural Lego bits. It is an enormous bin full of little pieces that we can sort through and build perspectives on Holmes and his work. And that is what we have in the chapters that accompany the transcription in this book, is a few first efforts at using the pieces that are in this tremendous transcription to examine Holmes's work from various perspectives.
The one thing I would add is that, I mean, Ross is very nice to talk about me all the time, but others, including Ross, played a really major role. Steve Epstein's essay is just superb. There's nothing like it that I know of. He's a brilliant, brilliant medieval historian. The students, there were undergraduates, graduate students, law students. They came from various backgrounds and subjects. I had the French looked over by a Senegalese graduate student. The German parts, actually, I couldn't find a German graduate student who had the time. So it turned out we had a really terrific aircraft mechanic at the university airport who was German. And so he said, sure, I'll do it. And so, I mean, this is a really major team effort lasting over 7 years. I joke that at least in one case, the student started as one of my students in a freshman honors class, and now he is a law clerk for a federal judge. So that gives you a sense of the time span. So, I mean, I think it has to be understood. While I take full responsibility for all errors, the amount of work that so many people put into this, and I have to mention the folks at Talbot Publishing. I mean, and Val Horowitz just was incredible, and the owner, Greg Talbot, put up with my occasional, hopefully it was only occasional, shall we say, I won't do this unless you do, and so I mean, this was it was a group effort. I mean, it was, to me, just a remarkable, how many times do you get a lot of people with different interests, different perspectives, different needs getting together and taking 7 years to produce something like this, And so I'm just grateful that everybody was willing to hang in there and do it. And I have to say about Ross that, had Ross not come in and taken over all of the sort of details of getting the book published, it wouldn't have been, because I was just unable to do it at that point. So it's not me. My name is one of the names on the title page, but by no means was it just me by any stretch of the imagination. I just emailed a whole lot of people I knew and said, how would you like to ruin your life for a few months at a time? No, seriously, well, particularly because, I mean, when you think about the number of languages that Holmes read and that the texts were in, you've got Latin, Greek, of course, English, law, French, German, Italian. I believe there was some Dutch in there. I think I recognized a few, bits of Hebrew. there aren't a lot of legal scholars who would feel comfortable working with those multiple languages. And so I wasn't just recruiting law students and law professors. As I say, Steve Epstein was the, Amundsen Murphy Professor of Medieval History here at KU. As I mentioned, I recruited this wonderful student from Senegal who was studying French, Afro-French literature. I got an aircraft mechanic. I mean, it was basically, the more I got into the text, the more I realized that there's just no one person who can possibly do that work. It's incredible that one man wrote this thing. It's just astonishing. I also would mention, because, we also have to thank Justice Holmes's executor, because Justice Holmes not only was writing it only for himself, but he left instructions that it be burned. He did not want it to survive him. It was too private a book. And happily, his executor didn't listen to him and gave it to the Harvard Law School. And so, I mean, if it weren't for, Harvard, we wouldn't have this. So, this book is the production, really. It started with Justice Holmes in 1885, or in the 1870s, actually, since some of the material came from earlier stuff, and went till, to today. I mean, this has been a centuries-long project. I only had 7 years worth of it.
I think there were two big challenges in writing for this book. And the first one is that just as Mike says, it's hard to think of someone who might be able to read and process in all the ways Holmes did. It's also hard to imagine someone just producing at the rate that Holmes did for as long as he did. And so to the extent that this kind of scholarship is partly looking at source materials to get a sense of the end product and of the character that produced them, you also need to process that production and that end character. And so there are roughly 2.5 million words worth of Oliver Wendell Holmes judicial opinions. And all of those words had to be read at least once in order to intelligently or marginally intelligently draw connections between them and the Black Book. So it was just a lot of reading and note taking. But that's great fun also. The other challenge, and in some ways the more difficult one, but also the more enjoyable one for looking at the book now that it's done, is the distractions. You get started down one path talking about Holmes and one subject, and you look at the reading list for 1911, and you see that why did he pick up Jane Austen? Well, maybe it's time to go back and look at this, right? And then you progress a little bit further along, and Alfred North Whitehead, why is he suddenly gobbling up all of Whitehead, right? And so the distractions that Holmes creates just in the course of doing this wide-ranging reading is a challenge in its own right. In other words, getting a grip on the entire mind of this character at one time is an overwhelming task. You gotta pick your focus and stick with it if you're going to get anything done with him.
Well, I mean, I think that, again, while scholars have used the Black Book here, there, and in part, the great biographers like Ted White or Mark DeWolf Howe, and there's so many. I hate to mention two, but because there are dozens who've done unbelievably wonderful books. But it's one thing to look at it and use a passage here and a passage there. it's another thing to spend years literally reading this thing. And then, basically, Steve Epstein and I and Ross and Steve McAllister to an extent in his preface. I mean, we got the opportunity to see into Justice Holmes's mind and his world in ways that others hadn't been able to in that detail. And so you can ask questions that, you couldn't ask or answer before. And so I think, Epstein's essay is just an absolutely brilliant, reconceptualization of what Justice Holmes knew about Roman and medieval law and history, to a degree that I don't think anybody has ever been able to do before. And Ross's being able, as he said, to see behind the opinions and behind even the sources for the opinions, like articles that Holmes read, to actually see Holmes's notes, but also to see his patterns of reading, so that you realize, by gosh, he really did study these things, and he studied them for a very long time, and he went back to them. I mean, one of the things that I think, is enormously significant is that the Black Book lets us not only see what he read, but he lets us see what he reread and reread and reread. And one of the things about the detailed notes on the books that he actually took notes about is Holmes was what I call an active reader. He didn't just take down passages that he thought were important. He argued with the books he read. And so it's almost like being in a room with Justice Holmes and some great German scholar or some great English judge, and there is Holmes arguing on paper, with the author of the book. And that too tells you something enormous about Justice Holmes. This man's intellectual world was astonishing. One of the reasons I became a lawyer was when I was a kid and I was studying Talmud. This really ancient rabbi, when he was talking about the joy of studying Talmud, said that when you study Talmud, you engage in a conversation 2,000 years in the making, and you're talking to people 1,000 years dead, and you are talking to people who will live 1,000 years from now. And to some extent, Holmes lived in that kind of intellectual world. People like Cook and Blackstone, Savigny, Justinian, they were alive to him. He didn't just read what they said to have a footnote. He was engaging in a conversation with them. And the Black Book is the only place that you can get that. And so when you begin to see those kinds of things, you begin to have insights that you just can't get. And Ross's essay and Steve Epstein's essay show those insights. And so, I think they're enormously important contributions to not just Holmes scholarship, but the scholarship of reading, the growth of, what we refer to as a republic of letters, and the understanding, I use it now when I talk to my classes about precedent, and I say, precedent is really judges talking to each other, over the years and arguing with each other. That, don't just think of judges who are on the same panel arguing with each other, through a dissent or a concurrence. That in fact, cases really are judges being able to argue with each other. So Justice Scalia could argue with Justice Holmes. It's given me a very, very different perspective, not just on Holmes and on the cases he decided, but literally on the way that judges read and relate to texts and to each other. And that's really I think it's the sort of hidden matrix of the Anglo-American common law, is when you begin to realize it's this marvelous ongoing conversation amongst lawyers and judges and hopefully law professors and law students, and that you suddenly understand you're living in this enormously rich tapestry of ideas. And I think, Ross's essay and Steve's essay illustrate how the Black Book really makes us understand that, sort of nature of the law in a way that I don't think most people are blessed to be able to see without that experience.
Well, I'm going to start with a bit of a follow-up to an observation Mike made about Holmes's relationship to his books. There are moments in his book diary where he will mention an author and say something like, did not finish. Or another one where he'll say, read all of, fill in the name of the author or the fictional character or what have you. Holmes is not reading, as Mike says, he's not reading a book or opening a book or flipping through a book in order to generate a footnote for an opinion or for a treatise. He is picking up a book and engaging with the author. And if he loses patience with the author, or the author somehow loses credibility with him, Holmes does not finish and moves on. Or Holmes is in the middle of a book when it's time to move from his summer home in Massachusetts to DC. The book gets closed and may not get picked up again until the next year. And the book may appear on 2 different lists. Or he gets caught up with someone and just reads it all, right? And he does not necessarily list all of the titles. And so when you're engaging with the Black Book, you're engaging with the engagement of this great mind with the books that he was working through. And one of the ways to think about this is to imagine Holmes's nightstand. What books are stacked on that guy's nightstand? How many languages are they in? How many topics do they cover? Why does, to the extent Holmes had a system of reading, is the system so cosmopolitan in terms of authorship, in terms of subject matter, in terms of format, moving from a book written on the history of a particular substantive area of law to a treatise on some other area of law, to a life and letters. I think it's actually a very funny example of this, to a life and letters of some great figure. One of the things Holmes wrote to one of his favorite correspondents, Pollock, was that he never reads life and letters. But of course, he did read life and letters. Was he trying to deceive his friend Pollock? Well, actually, no. We know that's not true because in previous correspondence, he'd written to Pollock about reading life and letters volumes. What Holmes is saying in a context like that is, at this moment, I am not thinking about that facet of my relationship with books. I am in another world right now. If you think of yourself and the way you read books, when you're deep into them, you are living in that world, not some other one, and you move from universe to universe. Just as it's hard to imagine another mind matching Holmes in terms of range and consumption and production, I can't think of another document like the Black Book that takes us so deep into a great mind's relationship to books. And I would, by the way, second Mike on the potential for Lincoln's to match this, if only we could get our hands on it.
what isn't about it that is, or what isn't relevant about it. No, I mean, again, you know, leaving aside Holmes's position in American history, leaving aside the innate interest in seeing into a person's mind, you know, history is not about simply great people or great events. It's about humanity. I mean, every single one of us is an historian, if for nothing else than our own lives. Our lives are our history. Our memory is simply a way of recording history. And I think one of the things that many of us have learned during the pandemic, when we lost physical connections with other people, is how important it is to being human, to have connection to other people. And, you know, I mean, so in that sense, the Black Book gives us a connection to this unbelievable person. You know, as it happens, my current project is transcribing another set of diaries by somebody that hardly anybody knows. Her name was Sue Adams. And her parents were pioneers who came to Kansas in the 1850s. And she became the first state librarian. And she kept a daily diary, again, for decades. And it's not like Holmes's. I mean, she doesn't record all the books she read or take notes on that. But, you know, for me, you know, I joke that I think I've fallen in love with her, because there's this one passage when she was in her early 30s, when she comes home from work and she goes to her diary and writes, you know, a young man came to me today and offered to marry me and said that I should accept it because I was getting to be an old maid and no one would have me. And then the next line is, why should I marry anyone who is my intellectual, social, and physical inferior? I shall never marry. And, you know, I smile. I feel that I know Zoo. As I say, I mean, some of my friends who I've talked to about the diaries, you know, joke with me, I've fallen in love with this woman. Unfortunately, she died 100 years ago. But I feel the same way about Justice Holmes. I wouldn't be so arrogant to say I feel like he's my friend. But what I do feel like is I think about the nights that he would spend reading to his wife, you know, in front of the fire, reading maybe a fairy tale or the newest light French novel. And I kind of feel like I'm just sort of sitting there quietly, not seen, in the corner of the living room, like one of the ghosts from Dickens's Christmas Carol. And, you know, it gives me a connection that I would never have before. That's to me, you know, the really lasting value of any kind of person's diary or notebook or commonplace book. But when you're dealing with somebody as Holmes, as iconic, as complex, as fascinating as Holmes, being able to connect to him, you know, I'll go back to saying it. The only one I want to do it with more is Lincoln. You know, I want to have Lincoln's commonplace book sitting in front of me so I can think about what he was reading and thinking about it. Because it really does. It lets you kind of be in the room with these people and be part of a conversation with them. And, you know, that's an amazing experience, you know. And so, you know, whether it's the diary of a young woman fighting for her place in Kansas in 1890, or a great justice of the Supreme Court, it's the human connection you get from this kind of what you know, it's informal literature. And as Ross said, it was written never to be seen by anyone. You know, it's kind of like a brain scan. And, you know, gosh, wouldn't you like to be able to have the same thing for Lincoln, for Washington, you know, for you pick your favorite heroes. And how can you not?
Yes, this is probably just repeating Mike here, and for which I apologize. But this is an uncurated look at a fascinating life. And I think part of the reason why we feel about this book the way we do, and we feel about informal diaries, the informal history that Mike talks about, is that while it is, of course, still curated in the sense that some things don't make it onto paper or are forgotten or what have you, it is a look into someone else's memory that, at least to some extent, feels like our own memories. This is, you know, Holmes's disorganized, incomplete, read all of this subject kind of list of his readings is sort of like the list of readings in here. I don't remember every book I read. I'm not sure I've read everything ever written by you know, Professor M.H. Hoeflich, but I've tried, right? Or at least all the stuff that was in languages I could read, or whatever the case may be. But we're getting a little bit of this brain scan of this part of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. In addition, and this is something I do say, in fact, to some of my students about the Black Book, is that it also reveals a lack of intellectual hauteur, a lack of a sense that only certain books are suitable for great minds to absorb. And so Holmes includes all these, you know, all these light works that he read. He also does what the modern equivalent would be, you know, I soak this one up via audiobook or via podcast, right? Whenever you're going through one of his lists and it says parenthetically, or sometimes he forgets either one or both of the parentheses aloud, that means Holmes has just soaked up an audiobook or a podcast, or at least the equivalent from that time. Holmes was an omnivore, apparently with the exception of athletics. Apparently he had no interest in athletics. Although he was apparently a remarkable physical specimen in his own right, or at least a remarkably durable one. But you know, he would listen to people tell him stories or read him books. He would read, as Mike says, to his spouse. He would pick up a book and put it down without finishing it. He would go on a binge, right? This is, you know, Netflix surely can somehow, you know, hook in some marketing here to binging, right? But Holmes is, in that sense, a good role model for the modern reader. Don't be too proud to read what you enjoy, and don't be too proud to put down a book without finishing it. And don't be too proud, particularly if you aspire to be an excellent and accessible writer, to read excellent and accessible writing wherever it appears, including children's books at your family home.
How many lawyers or historians or people interested in the law, if they got an engraved invitation saying, Justice Holmes will be at home 2 to 4 p.m. on Sunday. He looks forward to seeing you then. How many people wouldn't go? I think that's what the Black Book is. It's going to be a little harder than just going, because it's going to take a lot of work to go through the transcription and the essays, but it's an invitation to Justice Holmes's house on I Street for an afternoon salon to discuss what he's been reading lately. And how can you not accept that invitation? You know, I actually have been dreaming for the last 7 years sometimes. Literally, I go to bed at night and I dream I'm sitting there across the desk from Justice Holmes, and we're having a chat about, you know, a book he read. And, you know, I wake up with a smile on my face and I keep thinking, you know, I hope I get to go wherever he went so that I can really have that discussion on a higher plane.
I think this book is an intellectual box of candies. This is not something that you can or safely could open at page 1 and plow through to the end. But it is something that you could open to any page and not only learn something new, but probably find some inspiration to further reading on your own or further writing on your own. It's delicious and great fun.